Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health Podcast and our 10-part series on yoga, cultivating calm amidst the storm. So today I have the pleasure of having YuMee Chung with me. Now, YuMee is a former security lawyer who left a busy practice to engage more deeply with life. 2 decades later, she's a yoga and meditation instructor, co-owner of Toronto's Octopus Garden Yoga Center, writer, and mother of cats. And YuMee, we did this several months back where we did your first interview, but now given all of the wild changes that have gone on in the world over this last couple of months, we wanted to get back together to have another conversation that talks a little bit more about yoga in our virtual world. So we'll get to that soon enough. But YuMee, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
And thanks so much for having me and for opening the door to part 2 of this conversation, which I think so much brings the conversation full circle.
Yeah. Wonderful. So for people that aren't aware, can you just give us a little bit of background as far as how you transitioned from being a securities lawyer to being a yoga meditation teacher and how that process happened?
Absolutely. I was working as a junior lawyer in Toronto at a big Bay Street law firm. And in a sense, I had my midlife crisis early, right at the beginning side of my career. And a friend of mine introduced me to the practices of yoga during a particularly challenging time when I was overworking and losing a sense of perspective. My health wasn't great. I had repetitive strain injuries from spending most of my waking hours sitting at a desk. And when she first introduced me to the practices, I said, that's nice, but not for me. I'm too busy. I'm too busy for that. And to be quite honest, I never saw myself as a person who was inclined to do new age practices or self-care practices. That just didn't resonate with me. I was go, go, go and very type A. And she talked me into a class, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. It was an experience that managed to somehow push all my buttons. And the challenge of it brought me back over and over again, and it ended up being my saving grace. So important to my life that when I had an opportunity to re-examine how I wanted to show up for myself and for the others in the world that I live in, I realized that my yoga teachers were doing a better job of that than I was as a lawyer. They were affecting positive change in a way that I wish that I could do. And so somehow I found myself opening a yoga studio. I probably had no business doing that at the time, but it happened, and the rest is history.
Nice. Well, I'm certainly glad that you did, because then I probably would have never met you otherwise. So, although who knows? So YuMee, one of the things that I wondered about last time was just the evolution of practice. And you've been in this industry for 20 plus years now, I think. And so how does the practice tend to change and evolve as you go along? And is it necessary for it? Does it even need to? I know sometimes people get really frustrated when the practice is changing for them, but they don't want it to change. Or what is your opinion on that sort of aspect of things? How did it evolve for you?
That is such an interesting question, because thinking back, I realized that I actually started with something called a set series practice. And the meaning of that is that you come to your mat and you do the same movements in the same sequence every day without fail. And the strong container of that practice is part of the reason for doing it. it builds discipline and it builds resilience, and it gives you this litmus test by which you can gauge, like, how am I doing today? Because you do the same thing every day. I loved that ritual. In fact, I was rabidly attached to my practice probably for a good 4 years. Probably did that practice 6 days a week for 4 years without fail. And then things started to shift, and there was a feeling of loss when I was found myself stepping away from that strong container in the community that practices that way. And in retrospect, I see that that shift was necessary and inevitable, although there was a sense of discomfort or loss around it. You know, things obviously change as your life circumstances change. Things change as the body ages. And I think to hold to one practice as if that were the master key, I think that can be ultimately limiting or restricting rather than freeing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's stuff I find in health all the time too. It's the same as when I see people who might have been doing a very specific diet for a long period of time, and it initially was like game changing for them. It made a huge impact. They felt great. Everything was working really well for them. And then over the years, all of a sudden, it's like things aren't working so well. And even when we would check it, you might even see like there's imbalances and there's different things going on. And it's almost like as we transition through different aspects of our life, and like you said, sometimes we age, we have hormonal changes, we have different requirements, even different phases. It almost seems like in life that we are supposed to have almost different types of experience even. And if we're not paying attention to what the body is trying to communicate with us, it's easy to get stuck in almost like our brain says, no, we got to keep doing this because it had good results and it had whatever. And we stop kind of paying attention to maybe what directions we're being guided to move towards.
And maybe there's a lesson there for us about the necessity of staying conscious and present to what's arising and not too much defaulting into those habits and patterns, even if the habits and patterns have been ascribed, have been given the label positive, useful, meaningful, socially acceptable, to allow ourselves to reevaluate on a fairly regular basis, because as we know, humans are so well adapted. Well, we adapt. We're adapted to adapt. So what ends up happening is we get almost so expert at doing things a certain way that the benefits stop accruing. And that's where my friends in the exercise and fitness field would talk about things like progressive overload. It's useful to mix things up, to do things differently, and then to progressively challenge yourself within that paradigm. So yeah, ties in really nicely to the subject of managing change, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to move me towards. So how do you manage that when you have really quite drastic change happen all of a sudden? So if we look at what's going on in the world right at the moment, at the time that we're doing this interview, we are right smack in sort of the middle of lockdown of COVID-19. And I feel like that has been a big stressor on people's safety, on their not just their health safety. I feel like it started with more around health. And now that people have had a chance to kind of settle in with that feeling a little bit, and this has continued and we're still kind of locked down and people aren't working. Now I feel like it's more around safety and security, around finances, and are things ever going to get back to quote unquote normal? And what do we do? How do we adapt when we need to adapt? What does that look like in the yoga world right at the moment? Because I know classes are shut down. People aren't going to their yoga classes. Their network and their community have changed substantially. So hoping maybe you can speak a little bit about what's going on. What does that mean for the yoga community at this point?
Yeah, wow, there's a lot there. We shuttered the studio middle March. That felt like the right thing to do. And most of the I would say without exception, actually, all of the yoga studios, the bricks and mortar businesses, have by now all closed. I think you're right. When this first began, it really affected us on those really primary levels. There was, if you could even almost look at it as a Maslow's levels of needs. So, I mean, we were really looking at safety and security and survival of the organisms. And then as time has worn on, it's asking us to reevaluate on deeper levels, on more subtle levels. And this maps really nicely onto a yogic paradigm, which is called the chakra model. It's just a model of understanding human perception. And that model would also start us down at the level of survival, the level of basic human instincts. You know, how am I going to get my next meal? Where will I shelter? All of that stuff. And then we get into the finances and how am I going to take care of myself? How will I feed myself? And then it goes on and on from there. And I feel like we're now, maybe 3 to 4 weeks in, and it's still very uncertain. I mean, they haven't put an end date yet on this experience that we're all living. So the open-endedness of it in and of itself is so interesting, because it causes us then to think about, like, who am I and what am I going to be when all of this winds up, when we step out into the daylight, when we leave our homes, what will be there, and what roles will we all play? For the yoga community in particular, from the studio owner and the teacher side, it's big. It's big, to be really honest. I don't know very many studios that have deep enough pockets that can ride out a months-long closure. A lot of the studio owner friends that I have are really operating businesses that are kind of a subsistence business. They almost operate as more of a seva, which means service, a service project, the way that a community center or a temple might, more than a proper for-profit business. So people have really lean budgets. And so a lot of my heartbreak around this is wondering what will happen to the studio owners. And then, of course, the teachers themselves are often living very, very close to the line, and they are in not particularly well protected industry, in that the social net, isn't great. They're not people who are accruing pensions, for example, or because most of the yoga teachers who are working in Canada and maybe the US as well, they are not employees. So most of the employment standards protections that they would get are not typically there for them. So it's an interesting thing to be riding this along with a community of people who are deeply affected.
Yeah, and I think the yoga community, along with a number of them, I know, well, one thing that's been interesting is I know, say, for my profession, there's not really any naturopathic doctors that are in clinics anymore. They're all out. We're allowed to go in for essential services, but for the most part, there's not a lot of essential services that we would be needing to do. So everybody's kind of moved to more of a telemedicine platform. Fortunately, it's something that I had done for a couple of years before, so I was familiar with it, but people were dipping their toes in a little bit, trying it out to see what it was. There wasn't even a lot of even regulation around as far as what that was going to look like. And then once this started, it was like, right off the bat, it was like, okay, here we go. Everybody's got to move to that. And now the dynamic for ourselves, the dynamic with our patients, it's a different dynamic than being right with them. And so we've got to kind of navigate what that looks like and how to make that work so that it's still very effective and you can still create this sense of care and in this space that's going to be a healing environment. And what I've noticed is that I've seen more and more of the yoga practitioners starting to go virtual. And I know even my wife and I, we did a couples class, streaming couples class randomly a while ago, and it was really fun to do it. And we had a lot of great feedback around it too. So what are you finding like that? What changes when yoga, fitness, wellness starts to go virtual?
Yeah, for most yoga teachers, this is a new medium. Most of us are used to doing our work in real life, whether that is private work or teaching small groups or teaching large group led classes. There are very, very few yoga teachers that I know of, save for a few of the ones who would be teaching for some of the online services, some of those yoga pioneers and yoga rock stars. But for the most part, your community teacher is not used to being an on-screen personality. Some of what we do involves touch. A lot of what we do involves looking at people, being able to move around a room and to engage with people one-on-one. So suddenly to be in an on-screen environment is a really new thing. There's a new skill set that needs to be learned very quickly. And the idea that flattening the curve requires such a steep learning curve for so many of us. And of course, being a talking head, being a screen person, conjures up for so many of us this feeling of what would you call it, like performance anxiety even.
Yeah.
You know, suddenly a camera's on, oh my goodness, and something's being recorded, and it really just plays into that fear of public speaking and all of that. So I imagine there are a lot of people out there who are just dipping their toes into the online teaching world, who are aside from the tech issues, aside from all of the learning curve around the equipment and all of that, having to look back inside and go, oh, how do I feel about showing up like this? Wow. Are my deeper fears being brought up to the surface? Do I have imposter syndrome? Like all of that is being, I mean, it's a big, mucky, stirred pot right now. So
Yeah.
yeah, I can certainly relate to that feeling.
Well, and I think is really cool too in a lot of ways because it's like, for example, my wife Taya, who has been teaching yoga for a long time. She's excellent at it. She does it all the time. She lives that life very much. I mean, she could go in and teach a class with her eyes closed most of the time and be fine once she gets in the zone. And when she had to do a online class, it brought up so many different, stirs up all of these things around, again, like you said, you know, am I an imposter? Am I good enough? Like all of these things. It's amazing how much just having a camera on you can add that stuff. But it also gives the opportunity to sort of step into one other level that maybe you didn't get a chance to practice, because it's like, you know, you get sort of comfortable within your challenge. Whatever your challenge was, you sort of get to a point where it feels comfortable, and then that becomes your new normal. And then you might even think that you've gotten over certain things, and all of a sudden the next challenge comes in another way, and the same stuff resurfaces, but gives you another opportunity to kind of tackle it in a whole nother way. And so
Absolutely.
part of it, I
And
also so proud of her too, because it's like she did, and now she's excited to kind of do the next pieces of it too. And so just, you know, it's exciting to see what that's going to look like.
And it's actually wonderful that we're all kind of in the same boat. I have yet to teach my first live stream class, but I've had the benefit of taking lots and lots of classes with teacher friends of mine. And I've enjoyed them immensely. In fact, I've enjoyed them more than I thought I would. There's a palpable warmth and intimacy that comes across that I just didn't imagine would be there. And so now I'm feeling a sense of growing excitement about joining the party and getting online. And then at the same time, there's this feeling like, wow, there's an absolute avalanche of online virtual yoga instruction available, whether that is free offerings offered through Instagram Live or through Zoom or whatever that is, or whether they are really polished offerings through Yoga Glow or Alo or one of the online subscription services. It feels, for the independent yoga teacher who is yet to step into that arena, it feels like, where will my voice fit in that? Is there even any room for me there? Should I bother? There's so much good stuff out there. Do I even have a place? That again, I think ties into notions of like, where do I fit? Is there value to my contribution? All of that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I see the same thing with almost anything that goes online, because pretty quickly once it does, you can have lots and lots of people doing it. And again, I think wondering same thing, see the same thing in healthcare, right? But my thought on it too is like, if it's something that still grabs you or inspires you or makes you feel excited about it, if there's a part of that that gets you that you would like to share, even if it's then backs up because of some of the worries around it, but if there's something still inside you that wants to do it, I kind of feel then you eventually find your own tribe with it anyways. You'll find the people that will resonate with the way you do things, your personality, this sort of spin that you have on it, because that's what makes the classes so unique. I mean, a lot of times the classes might not, the actual movements might not be that different sometimes, but the experience can be completely different depending on who you're having it with.
Agreed. And I always say that if you want a perfect yoga class, you probably shouldn't come to my yoga class, because it's not a scripted, edited, and polished offering. It's in real time, and it's raw around the edges, and people come for a human relationship. They don't want to be taught by robots. And so I think that it takes a lot of that pressure off to be perfect. I mean, showing up warts and all is kind of just the way we do things. So
What do you think are some of the skill sets that will need to evolve if yoga moves more and more to being virtual? Like you said, you're not actually there able to do physical adjustments. You can't see the person so clearly. So it seems to me that a lot of transition is going to have to come to how do you use your voice. And but what are your thoughts on that? I'm thinking that's definitely going to be a change.
absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned that about hands-on assists falling by the wayside, because they were almost doing that prior to all of this happening. We are certainly living now in a culture of consent, where we are and rightfully asking people before touching. And at the studio that I run, we have consent cards that people put down, and people can flip their cards over pose to pose. You know, I welcome touch in this pose. Oh, please not in this pose. So we were already shifting towards that. And I really do feel like the age of those deep kind of gangbusters yoga assists that I remember from the olden days, you know, the one where the teacher would come over and lie on you and squish you into the deepest forward bend you've ever been in. I think that it's had its day. You know, we're seeing that there's some real problems around that kind of unwelcome touch. And certainly there have been really great commentators who have talked about the problems with authority and how consent isn't meaningful when you've got imbalance in relationships. So I found myself to be doing less hands-on assists naturally, and I was using more almost verbal assists. And what that looks like is where you sit down next to someone and you go, "Hey, Jason, consider moving this part of your hand," and so it's a no touch hands-on assist in a sense. So I think we were going there. And I would hope that with this online medium where we can see people through their computer cameras, that we could still be doing those one-on-one assists. I think it would be really cool to get skillful enough to be guiding a Zoom room full of people, and also be saying, oh, hey, so-and-so, I noticed that the outer edge of your foot has lifted. Consider pushing that down. So maybe there's still room for this. Concerned about the emphasis now that is being placed on physical demos for a variety of reasons. One, the staging of demos and the placement of the screen, I think, will really interfere with the way people practice. I think heads will, the gazing points in yoga where you might be naturally gazing one way or the other, that might be disrupted by a visual learner needing to turn to look at the screen over and over again. So I think there's something that there may be an overemphasis on seeing and looking. And then from the teacher perspective, I think what might then end up happening is we end up in the space of performative yoga, where teachers feel the need to demonstrate things that are perfect or impressive. Flashy poses might become then, right, the hallmark of a good teacher. Wow, did you see that teacher do a press handstand? So exciting. I'm going to go back to that teacher's class. And it may be something, it would be too bad, I think, that if yoga became even more externally valued than it currently is. That's something that I've been thinking about with the physical demos. And then, yes, the use of voice and communication through using our words. I think there's great value in doing that well. And I've been recording audio classes, audio only classes, like real old school, and leaving off the video component and trying to instruct it as if I was teaching someone who had no access to sight. So only through the channel, and it really is a good teaching challenge to do that. You can't rely on a visual demo.
Well, and it's kind of neat too to see what'll happen with as a practitioner. So someone that's or as a student, I should say, if you are used, and most people are more visual, that's the dominant sense that most people learn by. So if they're not able to utilize that as well, it may be really neat to see how much we develop our auditory cues around learning.
Yep. And in yoga philosophy circles, getting back to that chakra model that we had spoken about briefly, the sense of seeing is linked or associated with the solar plexus chakra, which is called Manipura, and that is the seat of the ego personality. And so it really does, that resonates with me, that the eyes are connected so much to the desires of the ego personality self. That's window shopping in a nutshell, like, ooh, what do I want? Oh, that person, keeping up with the Joneses, like, I want that, And then the sense of hearing is associated with the throat chakra, which is called Vishuddha, and that is the center of communication. And so the understanding is that one needs to listen well in order to communicate well. And so if we were able to cultivate deeper listening, overseeing, we're such a visual culture, if we could shift from seeing and saying to listening and then acting or doing, that would be a really cool opportunity here.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think that's really interesting, the way that connects up, and it totally makes me think about that old parable of that fellow that had the child, and basically just good and bad things kept happening, and he kept saying, well, good, bad, who knows? And then the next thing would happen, it would be something that would be really good. So I think, for example, he had a horse that ended up to his farm that he didn't have, and so that was good news or bad news. And everybody was like, oh, that's so great, that's so great. And he's like, well, good or bad, who knows? And then his son ended up riding that horse and fell off and broke his leg. So I'm like, oh my gosh, that bad horse, So I was like, well, good, bad. And then the army came to go to war, and he didn't have to go to war because he had a broken leg. So it was sort of this thing where you just don't know if something's really going to be beneficial or not until down the road. And I think about something like that, and like, what a wonderful way to almost have to drive the senses more inward and develop more communication. And what a perfect turning point that would be.
Yeah, actually, that is a really insightful point. Those who are able to find meaning in times of challenge consistently rate as being happier, as being more contented. No, I mean, that story contains such an essential truth. And what it really speaks to for me is that our perspective is so limited. We all live in these reality tunnels of our own making. And the idea that a broader perspective and the benefit of some time will give us an opportunity to reflect on both the challenges we faced and also the gifts that that we receive from having to tussle and tangle with the challenges that we are collectively meeting right now.
YuMee, for yoga teachers that are listening to this, that are new to this virtual world of teaching and whatnot, and wondering how this might go, how does someone monetize live stream classes and pre-recorded audio and video classes? What are some of the ways that they can even look into that?
Wow, I feel like I'm not an expert on this subject, and I feel like this is an evolving area. We are now in a reality where yoga studios are monetizing virtual classes. They're doing them in a variety of ways. Most I see are offering classes on a sliding scale. Most have priced the classes significantly below what they would charge for a class in a bricks and mortar space. Very few studios are holding to that same model, and I feel that those that will very quickly find that the market rates will dictate, and that people will just end up voting with their feet. So there is, in a way, prices for yoga classes are lower now than they ever have been. Without commenting on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's just the reality of our current economic situation. Then riding alongside the classes that are happening on a sliding scale is this concept of dana, which is a word that I'm borrowing from Buddhist circles. And the word dana means donation. And so there are lots and lots of by donation classes happening out there where folks are setting their class very, very inexpensively, like setting it at $1 or $2, or giving away altogether and saying, if you feel that there's some value here, and if you're able to pay, then please send your donation to a certain place. And that's a fascinating model because it's one that works really well in spiritual circles. I just did a fundraiser for the Daily Bread Food Bank in Toronto, and we were delighted to see that most of the donations that came in far exceeded the minimum that we had suggested. People are in a real space of generosity and giving if they're able to during this time, which is so heartwarming. But then I wonder how long that will go on for. Will we all end up with fatigue around this subject? So some people have suggested that yoga, virtual yoga, will follow the same route or evolutionary path as podcasts. And podcasts tend to attract sponsorship. You know, people aren't paying per view, paying for subscriptions. People tend to digest the material, and it tends to be free for listeners. It's just like there'll be corporate sponsorship. So that could be something that ends up happening for the yoga world as well.
Interesting. I hadn't really thought about corporate sponsorship, but yeah, that definitely could be connected well. It's interesting. It's going to be really neat to see what ends up happening as it all keeps transitioning.
Oh, and the one piece that I had missed was the subscription service. That's where libraries of pre-recorded classes are offered up for a low monthly rate. And I know that there are studio families or studio franchises that are now just launching their online services. And then, of course, there's ones that are fairly well established, most of them coming out of the US, where people can subscribe. And the rates there tend to be very low on a monthly basis, and they're relying on an economy of scale. So if you're paying $20 a month, you would need a lot of people paying $20 a month to really ensure that the teachers are paid well and that you meet your overhead.
Yeah, I've seen definitely more of that over the last while too. And I like that. I find a lot of times you can actually get quite a lot of value for a pretty low monthly overhead or a low yearly overhead. And you can get a lot of stuff now because once it's created, you know, people keep having access to it. So
Absolutely. And for the yoga students out there, this is an amazing time to be practicing. This is an era where all your favorite teachers globally are making content available, a lot of it very, very affordable, some of it free. You have unprecedented access to yoga. When I first started out, I had a VHS cassette of a set series practice, and I just did that cassette every single day for 4 years until it wore out. Uh, so I feel that from a student perspective, wow, you have got a smorgasbord of options. It's really so exciting. I just hope that the wealth of options doesn't somehow devalue what's out there, and I hope that it doesn't cause people to feel complacent, because everything's there at your fingertips anytime, and it's almost like the more available it is, the less you value it. So I hope that people still continue to hold these practices sacred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. It is true. It's almost like as things become more available, I think like even Freud said, you would always charge people for their service, because if it was too available and there was nothing, then they didn't value it the same way. So it's prices go down. If there's more abundance, I could see where that could happen. And at the same point, it may also see what evolves in the way that teachers start to present material and add another layer that might just be different than how it's been done in the past to bring more value to people, right? It's almost like if it's devalued, how do you then rise to create more value? What does that look like?
Necessity has always been the mother of invention. And while it's early days for this new technology for us yoga teachers, there is so much untapped potential. I feel like we could be doing more with what's available to us. And I'm so excited to see where yoga teachers take this. I think we'll be miles away from where we are now in a very short period of time as people bring their ingenuity to the table.
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a time where ingenuity is at its highest right at the moment. Like you said, when it has to be, it's there and it pops up, and we're going to get to see a lot of neat ideas, I think, surfacing. One other thing I would like to touch base with you about, Yumi, is we talk a lot about in yoga around the idea of taking our practice from the mat and into our lives. What do you feel, especially at this point in time, that would be some of the best teachings or practice that we would normally do in the yoga studio that we can now really incorporate into our lives given this whole global situation that we're at the moment?
So many of the philosophical teachings of this practice really talk to us about uh, the capacity to find ease in an ever-changing world. These practices really talk to us about uncertainty and the fact that the only defining constant in this reality we all inhabit is just constant change. You know, we are surfing change when we practice flow styles of yoga. That is what we do. We breathe and we move in a concerted way, and the whole thing lives and pulses. And so when we learn to be in an ever-changing flow that really defines the way nature moves. I mean, nature
Mm-hmm.
is constantly evolving, shifting, growing, changing. Suddenly we have a really nice template for living with ease, even in times of uncertainty. So philosophically and practice-wise, I feel like yoga is the practice for this time.
Well, yoga's got so many pieces to it. It's like I grew up doing martial arts for a long time, and I loved it. And I think part of what I really loved about it was not just the physical practice, but it was also connected to just a lot of other stuff. It went pretty deep, it tied into everything from Chinese medicine and meridians and organ systems and energy and a lot of different stuff. Meditation was a big piece of it, and focusing on breath work. And after I'd kind of injured myself a few too many times doing martial arts and was also practicing osteopathy and couldn't break my wrists anymore, I decided I needed to move to something a little bit, maybe a little more yin compared to that piece of it. And I fell in love with yoga for the same reason. It had so much depth to it. And I do feel that there's so much within the yoga practice. And that's why I wanted to do this series, because I feel like if people start to allow themselves to not just stop at asana, not just stop at yoga movement, but get into the other layers of it. You know, I did an interview with Hallie Schwartz, and she's really a yoga philosophy instructor. And she said a lot of times when people start yoga, it's like they walk into the door and they sort of stop at the first tenth of it with yoga asana, and that's kind of it. And they think they know yoga, but they really don't know all of the yoga. Maybe they go into the next tenth of it, and that's the breath work. But it's like you could spend your lifetime getting into different depths of the teachings, and really in a lot of ways use those teachings to navigate your life around.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's such a beautiful way that Hallie framed it. These are practices for living a meaningful life, an examined life. And there's a metaphor that lives in the body. When we bring consciousness into the sole of the foot, when we start to bring awareness into the ankles and the calves and the knees, I mean, that really is a metaphor for the awakening of consciousness. And the movement towards a state of super consciousness, or if you want to call it the state of enlightenment, really begins right where we are. It begins here with how you place your feet on the earth, or how you show up on the earth for your friends and your neighbors during challenging times. And so this intention to infuse every moment with awareness is so profound. And the intentions that we set at the beginning of class, you know, you may have been in a class and the teacher says, kind of in a very lighthearted way, oh, come set your intention, set your elevated resolution for this class. That's so important, because that becomes then the lightning rod around which all of your thoughts and your words and your actions start to form. And intention really determines outcome. Mm-hmm. I mean, just in life, if you don't plug your GPS coordinates into your thing, then the chances of getting somewhere are very slim. And so we get really good about holding enlightened intention, and then holding enough conscious awareness moment to moment, breath by breath, so that we can keep navigating to where we hope to be. So I think it's a lovely practice for this time. Mm-hmm. And it's one that can happen on a 2-foot by 6-foot yoga mat. I can even fit a yoga mat in my tiny place. It's just, you can do it anywhere. If you could push the furniture aside and unroll a little bit of PVC on the floor, you're set. Yeah.
YuMee, given that this is sort of, we're having this conversation during some pretty major changes going on in the world, given all of the stuff that's transitioning, taking away the hardships that people are going through, the scary stuff, the grieving, the different things that people are being challenged with, is there a silver lining that you would see, or that you could maybe speak about a little bit when we do go through great times of transition?
Great times of transition have an incredible way of distilling for us what's important, what's necessary, and what turns out not to be necessary. And at the end of every yoga class, we finish with a pose called Shavasana. And Shavasana translates into English from the language of yoga, Sanskrit, to mean corpse pose. And so every single practice culminates in this thing, corpse pose. And that's profound for a culture that lives mostly in denial of death, of endings, of catastrophe, calamities. We are so much in denial of that. We're so deeply uncomfortable with facing those parts of our existence that to meet it every time you get on the mat and to really contemplate the essence of fear itself. I mean, one could say the fear of death is the essence of fear. So the capacity to do that is profound. And death meditations, which are commonly practiced in many meditative traditions, including Buddhist traditions, ask us to confront the certainty of our own passing regularly. And on a day where you say to yourself, well, this could be the day that I die, you are not going to waste energy and time on petty dramas. You're not going to waste your precious time and attention on social obligations that mean nothing to you. You know, like all those things that are sort of at the forefront of a normal busy life start to recede when you look at the possibility of life being finite, and you realize how unbelievably precious this time is. And so I think we're all in some way being asked to examine what's important, where are our values, and what is the center of the orbit. How am I going to organize myself so I orbit around that which is good and beautiful and meaningful for me, and not around something that someone else said I should want, or the endless striving for the markers of success, you know, money, buying stuff, all of that.
Mm-hmm. No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that it sets up a huge opportunity for change in perspective very quickly. YuMee, where can people learn more about you? Where can they see where you're going to be doing your next virtual classes? All of those types of things. Where is the best place to send people to learn more about your work?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think Instagram might be a good place. Instagram, YuMee Chung is my handle, and that'll point you towards any projects that I've got on the go. octopusgardenyoga.com is where the schedule, the virtual schedule I'm teaching on lives. And there are lots and lots of other projects that we're contemplating. So as those roll out, I'll definitely share them on Instagram.
Wonderful. I will make sure that we've got all of your contacts in the show notes so people can learn more about you and what's going on. I know you do lots of retreats. I imagine those are a little bit on hold at the moment until you know for sure what's going on, unless they're farther down the road.
Yeah, we're holding off on retreats, although I had a fascinating conversation with a retreat center owner. He's building a world-class retreat center very close to Kingston, Ontario, which is driving distance from Toronto. And we had a conversation just before this on what a socially distanced retreat would look like. Like how could we bring people together in this climate? So that was an interesting conversation. So just people are always thinking.
I like that. I'd like to hear how that would work out.
I think lots and lots of walking meditation in the woods, and
yeah, that could all be good. YuMee, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your energy and experience with us. Really appreciate it.
And thank you so much for providing this amazing forum for discussion. I'm so enamored with what you're doing. It's fantastic. It's an amazing service.
It's been my joy. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.